James Chau, welcome to BRI Dialogues. It's 22nd of October. You're in beautiful Hong Kong, and Anush in Durham, and I'm in London. What a pleasure to have you with us. And why not kick off this conversation in this episode of BRI Dialogues about what you see from your vantage point of view as the greatest challenges in China-West relations? How is this impacting the world around us? What are we missing from where you are sitting, James?
Well, from where I'm sitting in Hong Kong, I want to say, needless to say, thank you so much for having me, Ali Bohani, and also Professor Shami. It's such a joy to be in conversation with you, and congratulations on the start and continuation of BRI Dialogues from where I sit in Hong Kong, which in a way is a very transient city, and is a transient city by history, being a place where ships come and go, and therefore where goods come and go and people come and go. I think that what we're missing in the world is tolerance, and a tolerance for ideas, ideals, and values, where one part of the world may feel that they have a moral freehold on what they determine as good ideas, and also where, from their standpoint, they exclude the rest of the human family from participating in that system. I think what it's created is a buildup of pressure and tension. Yes, we often liken it to a boiler cooker, for example, where you see that pressure building up. But I think it's much more than that. There is no release valve recently. In fact, what we've seen on top of that and in combination is a return and an acceleration in populism, in nationalism, a rise in inward thinking that is being fueled by the leaders whom we've chosen, who've been chosen for us, or who've been elected around the world. And you see the borders being blurred, and also that division, that very tidy, neat division where we came from a world of the Cold War, the Iron Curtain. It is no longer those colors, and no longer are they even shades of those colors. It's far more nuanced and far deeper. But speaking of the Cold War, when you look back to people like President Carter, Zbigniew Brzezinski, and particularly Deng Xiaoping of China, you see that if they were able to achieve what they achieved, which was a marriage of ideas and an encouragement of that marriage, if they could do that during some of the deepest points and the deep, dark points of the Cold War, why can't we do it now, even with the pandemic?
James, of course, we can add President Gorbachev to that list of dignitaries in terms of stepping in and so on. I get the sense, well, two things actually, James, in response to your comments, opening remarks. The first is the West, particularly the United States, seems to have stumbled onto China's rise. I don't think we can call it China's rise any longer. China is there, thank you very much, and good night sort of thing. But there seemed to be this sudden, oh goodness, look, we've got a rival. But it's the way in which they depict China as a rival. That's one thing. But also the narrative, while you said the Cold War era, we need to learn lessons from it, I don't see the parties being able to invent new sets of dialogues that, as you say, puts humanity beyond the, if for want of a better term, the narrowness of the national interest. Why are these again becoming ships flying by night along each other rather than converging on critical themes? You know, COVID is one thing, hopefully we'll get beyond COVID, but climate change, it seems to Ali and I, is something which is much more permanent and genuinely needs global power involvement. Why are these folks continuing to speak the language of the 20th century when in the 21st we are dealing with common crises and problems?
I think the answer lies in two things you mentioned. First of all, we don't have the figures of Gorbachev around anymore. You have of those tripartite or more of those figures when you look at Carter, Brzezinski, Deng Xiaoping, none of them are alive today. Gorbachev is not as active as age would allow him to have been in the past. So I think you've seen a dying out of those figures. And those figures meaning really great visionary individuals who did not only rely on diplomacy, but thought very creatively around the issues. I think in terms of the second thing that you mentioned there, was the national interest side, that, going to the UN over the years, particularly to the General Assembly, where you saw that surge of world leaders in one place at one time, and all therefore the UN, you often saw about how brilliant they were on the world stage. People like David Cameron, for example, who was a great champion on antimicrobial resistance. He was a great pusher, even in the G7 and the G20, on putting that on the agenda and also trying to create a new class of antibiotics, which there hasn't been one since, I think, around 1983. But when these leaders go back home and they speak to their domestic constituents, they behave very differently. And the Secretary General, Ban Ki-moon, I mentioned this to him once, and I said, don't you often find that the people that you see backstage behind that podium in the General Assembly hall are very different to the people that you then read about in places like CNN or the Times? They're completely different. It seems that when the world stage, they think big, they act well, and then they retreat into the shell when they're back home. And it's suddenly very, very local party politics where the people's interests are not at the core, which of course is ironic because that's what they're there to do, that's what they're paid to do, and that's what they're mandated to do. I think ultimately when you look at things, and I was speaking to someone yesterday about this, greed is at the center of all the ills of the world. It has corrupted the media, it has corrupted the politics so many times over. This obsession with advertising and ratings and viewing figures has now been exacerbated by the digital era, where ratings, advertising, viewing figures are precisely what drives content and what then gets monetized or not. So I think in terms of why are they ships in the water at night and why they're sailing past each other is because they're so focused on their national interests. You mentioned climate change, and not only because I am in China, but because I can see it from a different side, being British and yet Chinese, and then being here in this very special city, is that we've seen a number of major commitments from Beijing. One is the hosting of the COP biodiversity talks. The first part took place virtually in Kunming, with the second part to take place in person, hopefully in April, when travel restrictions are easier to work around. You've seen them commit to carbon neutrality, a carbon-free world by 2060, before 2060. And then you've seen them now commit to saying, we're not going to be funding any more coal projects internationally. These are all extremely significant, and I think most of the world will agree on that. And I think, it's not so important about who turns up in Glasgow in a couple of weeks. We've seen leaders turning up all the time and then doing nothing. I was in Doha, I was in Paris, I was in Durban. I was there when the COP21 agreement was signed. I saw it when the meeting went overdue by a day, because that went into my birthday. So I remember that time very well, and how they all sat there patting each other on the back as if they'd done the job well. In fact, you haven't done the job well, and that's why we continue to meet for these COPs in the first place. So I'll be looking at Glasgow not to see who's turning up, but who actually did something, rather than use Glasgow as a soapbox for their own national interest, as you said, going back and retreating into that shell.
That's a
just on that one, before Ali comes in, do you have much expectation of COP26?
I don't have much expectation of global leadership as a collective, because the divisions are more entrenched than they were even 6 years ago in Paris. And we have been corrupted by different administrations that we've seen globally. And I'd say, thank God we have Asia. I'd say, thank God that we have the Near East, and that we do have leadership coming from some of those countries who believe that multilateralism is the way forward, that we still have people like Jeffrey Sachs, for example, who will always be a champion for doing things that are inclusive so that the SDGs don't become an empty slogan of leaving no one behind, but we're in real danger of allowing those people left behind even further behind because of the pandemic, of course.
And we were talking about, leadership. I always say these days there's a great run on, even shortage of base metals in some cases, copper, nickel. We see that in auto sector and rare earths. And I say if instead of searching for base metals, we were looking for base respect, and in rare earths, the rarest earth at the moment is common sense and pragmatism. And that brings me to my next question, James. What is the role of people? I mean, a lot of times from Western optics, China, and we forget that this is 1.4 billion people like us with the needs in the West, and they want to send their kids to the best schools. They want to, prosper. And I always say a failed China is the biggest liability economically and from a prosperity point of view for the rest of the world. What is as somebody who leads communication and dialogue in more ways than one, how can people bridge some of these differences in void of leadership, in your view?
I think increasingly they've done just that, Ali. I mean, we've seen cities, smart cities, and we've seen city mayors take the lead on climate change in the United States after the withdrawal from the Paris Agreement was activated by President Trump. We saw those people, those globally minded citizens and citizens with compassion at heart rise to that challenge. We then also saw brands, big brands speak out about climate change. I remember, and I do work with them as well, but I remember when Tiffany and Company, the really famed historic jewelry and watches house, put out this ad in, I think it was the New York Times, a full-page ad. There was no branding involved. It was a simple personal letter to their next door neighbor on Fifth Avenue and 52nd, 51st to implore him not to withdraw from the Paris Agreement because humanity was at stake. We've thought about climate change so long and so often in terms of polar bears and sinking islands. And of course, it is just that. But it's more than that. The self-interest here is that humanity is not going to survive this. So speaking from the communications angle, I think the one mistake that the climate movement made and the climate action movement made was that they threw out very big words early on. And I believe in consistency, but I think the message essentially has not changed. Since the first time I went to a COP, which was around 2013, so almost 10 years ago, they were saying, this is our last chance. This is the tipping point. And they were right. This is the last chance. This is the tipping point. But, in a sense, they were so concerned with using big words and catchy headlines that, in a sense, they also cried wolf. And now no one runs when the wolf cries. So I think from a communications point of view, there has not been a sustainable messaging line. There have been no new messages, and it's become very stale.
But James, 10 years ago, people were not experiencing perhaps the ravages of climate change in ways that they do now. So it's what they hear, they actually experience. And this thing seems to be a leveler. It's UK, Italy, Greece, Spain, Germany, as much as China, India, Australia, United States. Climate change doesn't recognize boundaries, poor, rich, white, black, and so on. And that message is very much, in many ways, ground up. So why is this still skepticism if the people across the world are feeling, experiencing this dire condition which has come about because of our abuse of the planet?
I assume you're referring to climate skepticism.
I am, yes.
Well, from the terms of climate skepticism, we could speak about that and even draw it out further. You could also say with all that wealth and investment to science? Why do people not believe in using masks? Why don't people believe in the good and the social good of vaccines? I think it also goes to why don't people believe that climate change essentially exists, that there are so many conspiracy theories, which, by the way, in terms of COVID-19 are largely driven by individuals based in the United States and in so-called Western liberal democracies. And that term in its sense is very loaded. It's driven out of there, out of those very countries that are blaming people who look like me, Asians, and specifically Chinese, of diminishing the planet to an extent that we're all being made to pay. In contrast, you saw a time when I was living in Beijing, and we very openly shared that how bad the pollution was. The air pollution was perhaps the most obvious for us to see in person because it is a barrier to our long vision. Then we had soil pollution, water pollution, in addition to the air pollution. But I think people began to act on that. That's how you then created climate activists in China, not in terms of the Greta Thunberg type. And I don't think that that necessarily is a model that fits with the Asian culture. We're far more introverted in a sense, far more circumspect and discerning. But we're climate activists, I think, in the sense that we're acutely aware of climate change, having lived through some of the impact of that, and we've done something about it. So you now see parents in cities who live in high-rise blocks where there's no scope for interaction because of the vertical design. They're beginning to design roof gardens, take their children to the suburbs to pick fruit and vegetables at the weekend. So it's much more than just climate, but it goes to sustainability. How do we contribute as the biggest chunk of the human family at 1.4 billion people to the sustainability of the planet so that we keep the heartbeat in the planet going rather than chopping it off at the knees and allowing that heartbeat to slowly fade away. I think in terms of skepticism, it's incredible that platforms like Facebook, on the one hand, could have been aiding organizations like WHO with really good messaging at the start of the pandemic, who now essentially have become those platforms for hate crimes, and for conspiracy theories that are much more than just theories. They claim lives, they kill people, and they put other people at detrimental risk.
That's very insightful of you, James. Given that, you know, clearly climate change as a global issue has been politicized. It's interesting that as you said, when you look at non-Western societies, well, particularly outside the United States and places like Brazil and so on, that there is people action taking place.
Yeah.
Given that so much of the world is now urbanized, that the metropolitan centers are the gravity of humanity now, do you think that it's time for United Nations to be side-streamed and a new movement at city level replacing, or so maybe that's too strong a word, running in parallel with the United Nations, which is this top-heavy organization, to one that deals with mayors of New York and Beijing and Shanghai and Paris and London and so on, people who have their hand on the pulse of majority of humanity, and that actually we should cut our losses and keep the General Assembly as a showpiece, but actually act through the largest cities. I mean, as you know, there is a movement on that front, but do you think that should actually become an institutional at the global level?
First of all, I think that we need as much help as we can. So creating another movement need not replace the other, but could be in addition and would also strengthen one another. Secondly, I would be, I think it would be suicidal if the world didn't have the United Nations. I think it's the United Nations that has kept the world going. That if we didn't have the Security Council, if we didn't have the General Assembly, and those are only parts of the year, if we didn't have all the agencies and the people who work for them with their mindsets and their vision, then I think the world is completely lost. Lost not meaning lost in direction, lost meaning non-existent. I think this is precisely the time when we defend our multilateral system, that we look at the benefits of globalization and try to repair the aspects of globalization that have not worked, and that we strengthen the role of the UN. The WHO is one example of that. Where would we be in this pandemic if they weren't sending out vaccines through COVAX, if they weren't appealing to governments and using their role as a moderator to bring them together, if that they hadn't created an air corridor with Afghanistan when Western-led forces withdrew so suddenly and brutally after going in there in the first place in war, that the WHO and the UN are left to pick up the pieces every time. And so I think this is the time actually to give them more muscle and tissues and tendons, so that the body that is the World Health Organization, or more widely the UN, is allowed to prosper for the people. In terms of city levels, in fact, I think it's thanks to the UN that we have so many of these city-centric initiatives. I learned when I was with UNAIDS and when I was a goodwill ambassador for them first, about city levels. And that's when I started moderating and being in rooms where city mayors would come together, either city mayors within a region, say of Australia, or through the country, or city mayors throughout. And I also was involved with a global health initiative, which is an international initiative, but was hosted in Shanghai that particular year, where I think we had over 100 city mayors from all parts of the world coming together on one stage. I remember even getting them onto the stage. It took so long to read the cities. I think it was about 15 minutes to get them on the stage, get that picture, and then get them off. So the UN is not the alternative to the city idea. I think the UN is the birthplace where those ideas are actually coming from and do continue to come from, not only in terms of cities, but also public-private partnerships. And when you look at HIV and AIDS in particular, that's been a transformative response from an epidemic of, for sure, the dying, if not the terminally ill, and now almost to a non-communicable disease based on where you live, access testing, and then getting onto treatment early enough for it to take impact. But in theory, it is a non-communicable disease. And if we could achieve that from June 1981 to now 2021, exactly 4 years in that span, if you can do that with that, actually the pandemic, the global trade disputes that we see radiating out of the US, involving also China, but also the EU and many other parts of the world, you can surely fix all those quite easily.
Interesting, you both talked about the role of UN and the challenges thereof. And I remember a few weeks ago, just after the United States pulled out of Afghanistan in September, when Secretary General Antonio Guterres said, "Don't count on us anymore." we're not. So it comes to a strange inflection point, as you both touched on. And I'm thinking maybe the word and vocabularies have to change. You're a man of communication, James. Maybe our vocabulary is failing us. The definition of many of these words, democracy, the meaning of democracy, liberal democracy, maybe globalization should be called, moving forward, harmonization of humanity, of how we work and how we deal with each other. And I want to ask you a question, James. China has been extremely successful, fast, and robust in catching up on industrial economic front. But its narrative and story is still very domesticated. There is a gap in introducing China to the world in a language and in a mode that the rest of the world would appreciate and understand. I'm not talking about propaganda. I'm not talking about just, vanilla flavor marketing, but China is failing to bring its story out. Where is the gap, in your opinion, as a man of communication?
I think it's not good at storytelling. And I think that comes from the home, because I think that our people, like your people, the Persians, are very warm, and that the heart of the home is the table. Yes, we come from countries with extraordinary cuisines and flavors and spices. But also we use the table as a gathering point. But that said, they're not as demonstrative in that love and care outwardly. I know that the way that I grew up is very different to the way that a lot of my fellow Chinese grew up, whether we're overseas Chinese or whether we're part of the home Chinese in mainland China. You know, my parents were very much along the lines of, I love you. I think the word love is used many, many times a day. It takes a long time to say goodbye on the telephone. And I'm sure both of you are smiling. I'm sure it probably happens in your families as well. And the physical affection, that closeness, that intimacy is very, very apparent. And they don't, and I think whilst they're very, very warm inside and so emotional and so loving, there's also a form of protection that creates a ring and a barrier around that. You know, it's a fact of history that the 20th century was so difficult for China. You know, multiple invasions by Japan, and then also kind of this semi-colonization by Western powers. And I think when you are beaten into a corner and the people are so poor and hungry and illiterate, then you find a way to survive, not to the next day, but even just to survive till the end of that day. And that is a way by enclosing your feelings and getting on with the job, which is why they're so brilliant at blocking out the noise in the world right now. I think they treat it with appropriate seriousness and gravity, yet also there is a side to them that thinks, thank God we're not like that, and they move on. And so you've seen that in the time of this pandemic alone, they've been able to innovate, expand, and grow despite global shortages, despite problems now with the chip market. They've continued to accelerate, and they do that even more so now that the rest of the country, or the rest of the world has sort of paused and even retreated. They don't get tied up in words. And that has contributed to the issue of a lack of storytelling. But also, because they haven't invested in what you appropriately call that vanilla marketing, they haven't got caught up in things that are meaningless. And they don't believe in going out and talking about democracy if you're not practicing democracy at home. And while all kinds of words are used to describe their style of governance, I actually think that there are many beautiful forms of democracy being practiced there. For example, how can you argue against it when over 700 million people have been yanked out of poverty and being put on a program and a track which allows them to prosper? How can you argue with a country that has a serious climate action program and climate justice program in place? How can you argue with a country that looks at food security, where the leader of the country says, reduce the amount of food that you have on a plate, stop over ordering, even though it is in our culture, particularly when you invite guests, to over order because you want to show your love to them. But now the greater love is to conserve and to share, and to ensure that more of us have across the board, rather than a lot of us have nothing and a few of us have too much. And that goes exactly for the vaccine, that this is the most vaccinated country by people and almost by percentage points, that this is the country that has given more vaccines than any other country in the world, despite how other countries would skew their figures. So it's about innovating and sharing what you have. Democracy is not just about the traditional indicators of democracy. Ultimately, it's about, are you delivering on your people? Do they have the basic needs, which they now do in China? And where's the next step where you give them more than their basic needs? And I'm heartened by what I see recently. I know everybody is shocked by the president saying that you can only, play games at 3 hours a week or 1 hour a week, I can't remember what it is. My parents didn't allow me to play 1 hour a week, and we didn't even have computer games at home. I don't think that my parents would have spent their money on computer games. And I know I say computer games, I mean, like, even the handheld ones that we had in those days that cost a couple of pounds. I don't think we would have had that, and they didn't even want us to watch television. So I think that there is a very paternalistic approach to governance in China. And I think good luck to all of us, because I think that we need that. If internet companies are coming in and corrupting the hearts and minds of your children and your adults, and you've got camps for digital detoxification, that's a very, very sad thing. We need a leveling out. It's not this kind of leveling out where you can't become rich. It's a leveling out, meaning that we all need to have at least something. And in terms of the vaccines, you've seen this huge weight towards the global north versus the global south. Our planet will be so much healthier if we would distribute it much, much more evenly across that, even with the same number of vaccine doses currently available.
I couldn't agree more. And just quickly, before Anush jumps in on that element of computer games, I was as well somewhat shocked that the whole world was very disappointed when private tutoring was canceled, at spending $120 billion per annum for learning and studying things that in 10 years time, 15 years time, the job market has changed, technology has changed. And I think that comes back to dual circulation and sense of collective growth. That may be not a bad strategy in hindsight as well. I think sense of collective is something that is very interesting in your society. I park it there and I let Anush jump in.
Just very quickly on that point, I was talking to friends because I wanted to get their ideas on where the axing of that private tutoring comes from. Does it mean that we don't want you to improve, we don't want you to progress? Far from it. I think they want the whole country to progress together so that it becomes tolerant and inclusive, and where that growth is more evened out and not focused in pockets. Because China is not Beijing, it's not Shanghai, it's not Shenzhen, it's not Hangzhou. It is 1.4 billion people, as you say, who live in every part. And particularly, we have a social and civic duty to support the people who live in the rural areas. The Chinese people are rural people. They don't come from high rises and from cities. They come from the heart of the countryside. The president was a farmer himself for, I think, 7 years when he was sent to, not even impoverished, but one of the most cut off parts of China at the time, where he was living in a valley and living in a room carved out of a cave. And, the thing with tutoring is that you've seen all these companies come in and make a lot of money. And you've seen parents then becoming shareholders of that business, in the sense of not shareholders literally in the company, but where the industry is fueled and pumped by parents who are willing to spend all this money. So you have all these people going to Yale and Tsinghua and Oxford, but what about the rest? You talk about the SDGs where you want inclusive growth. Is it inclusive when people have learned how to game the system? Because they go to tutoring colleges and they know how to write the application forms, they know what to say in the application forms, because you paid an Ivy League educated professional $70,000 to do that. I'm an uncle to a 3.5-year-old in Hong Kong. And at the moment, he's applying to different schools. And I'm slightly despairing, and I've told my brother and sister-in-law this, about the huge amount of financial investment everybody is going to make for the next 15 years of his education. And then that's before you go to college, which of course every American parent rightly worries about. But, I have in mind, I have my own plan, that I want to send him to a school in Europe at some point, even for its only summer camps or for the last 2 years, because I want him to learn about values. I want him to learn how to serve a table. I want him to know how to anticipate people's needs. The greatest thing to me, and people have always said to me, did you always want to become a news anchor? No, I didn't know what a news anchor was at the time. But I understand the power of communication. I understand the beauty of storytelling. And I also understand that my greatest wish in life is to be a servant to people. And from our parts of the world where our families come from, to be a servant is the very, very bottom of the social system. In cultures where the social class system is quite entrenched. Yet I believe that being a servant to people, to humanity, to your next door neighbor, whoever it is the most noble, most dignified thing that you can do, to contribute to people's progression. And in terms of language, Ali, you talked about what are some of the words that we need to use. I think language is very important. We got very carried away with, yes, we can, and change is possible. If you don't say meaningful change, change that brings moral prosperity, change that allows people to transform their lives, and in a half generation, as we've seen in China, be able to lift not only yourself, but your elderly parents and your children, they all get lifted up with you at the same time because you have realized some financial competency and financial literacy.
James, I can just let the tape run for the rest of the day. I know you have other commitments, but I'm happy to put aside all of mine to hear you speak from the heart, but also through your experiences at such a distinguished level that you are at now as well. I've got a shed load of questions, but I know I have to reduce them to just a handful going forward. Not even that, James. But just one comment. When President Xi Jinping did say about limiting computer games, the streets of Durham were abuzz with, why can't we do the same here? So,
oh, was they?
Yeah, it was actually
come over and join us.
It was received as about time somebody intervened about this stuff, so it's not always the flip side of what happens in China. It does resonate. It does resonate.
The style and the lack of storytelling can come off as a little heavy-handed, but I look at the outcomes. I don't look at the style. If you have too much style and no substance, then there's no deliverable on that. So let's try to get through your questions, and I'll try to answer them as briefly as possible.
So you'd be remiss of us if we don't bring up the Belt and Road Initiative, given that we are actually BRI dialoguing, as it were. And I want to position that with relation to global institutions. There are tensions, as you know, at the global power level about the BRI. And yet BRI, to Ali and I at least, it seems to be weaving relationships that are much more durable than boundaries. And China's rolling these out across Eurasia, we see as promise of change that maybe resonate domestically, but also go beyond it. But do you think that at a different level, involvement of the global South in the BRI can provide a bridge between China and the United States in particular?
Geopolitically?
And indeed culturally as well, both.
Yes, and I think it's done that for thousands of years. I was at my friend's home, and his grandfather used to live in that house. And so therefore there were his leather-bound albums from the 1930s. There was one called Die Reise, 1937. He went to Beijing at the beginning of that year, a few months before the second Japanese invasion. And there was a picture taken outside the Forbidden City with camels in the snow with trade on their back. So going to your question, yes, of course. I don't think China necessarily wants to be the global moderator, because there's enormous responsibilities that come with that. But certainly I think it recognizes that as a permanent member of the Security Council, as the world's second largest economy, it does have constructive roles to play. And it's done that in Afghanistan. It's done that with making major investments and contributions, not just investments, into the SDGs for the sub-Saharan African countries. So, I'm sure it feels that it can be useful somewhere, because peace for the world is good for peace in China. Then why not?
I want to pick up on that. We had this conversation a few weeks back, James, you and I as well. But Anush nicely touched on the BRI. This digital renminbi, which is replacing and coming, and this, I would say, digital Silk Road as such, where are you seeing it's going, sitting in the de facto heart of finance for China for many decades in Hong Kong, the city of finance? How would you see that this whole element of a parallel digital monetary system will bring and accelerate this bonding for many of these countries in global south and the future of trade. Not to replace dollar necessarily, but how can that really accelerate development and growth?
Firstly, I don't think, and I don't speak for China in any way, but as someone who's lived here for many years, all of my working life, I would say that no one seeks to replace anybody. That is a fundamental misunderstanding, that people think they want to be the sole superpower in the world. When you are the sole superpower in the world, you have enormous responsibilities. And when you wake up in the morning, I imagine in China, you think of only the problems that still need to be fixed at home, ensuring that people have more than just the basic amount to eat, the basic education, the basic clothes to wear. It was so poor before that, my colleague was telling me the other day that you used to have one set of clothes in one household reserved for going out. At home, you'd wear pajamas or whatever it was, and there was only one clean set of outdoor clothes that you would share. So only one person in the house could go out at any one time. Is it a de facto financial hub? It's not. It's very important, Hong Kong, because it's part of the international system. But now we have Shenzhen, we have Shanghai, and they've been running for a long time. I wasn't going to say that, but I will say it in the context of not being de facto, because not enough people here are even involved in cashless payments. So we are beginning to use things like Alipay and WeChat, but still I think it's going to take some time for people really feel that they're really part of it, that it becomes part of their lifestyle. Whereas over mainland China, just 7-8 minutes by high-speed train, if the borders were open now, you find a totally different world. It's a look inside tomorrow's world as it happens and before it comes to other places. The digital RMB will be played out a little bit during the Beijing Winter Olympics, when not only Chinese people, but also foreign teams, and because I don't think there are going to be spectators, but athletes and coaches and delegations will be able to try out wearable cashless payments in a way that, say, Apple Watch offers, but think 10, 20, 30 times on top of that. So digital payment, I think, is something that's interesting, and I think it's something that we need to continue looking out for.
I know that Anush will bring it to a nice closure, but one quick tip and point of advice from your optics. This is our common question, Anush. What is your message to Sinophobes? What is your message to Sinophiles? If you were to leave them with one piece of advice to each of those two groups.
When you talk about stop Asian hate, you're actually talking about stop Chinese hate, not just stop China hate, but stop Chinese hate. And when you hate, you are hating on the Chinese person that you know down the street, in your house next door, your teacher, your fellow classmate. You're actually harming them. Don't think that you can sanitize it in that liberal democratic way, where you can go out on the streets and talk about stop Asian hate and Black Lives Matter, yet in parallel, you're treating us so badly, treating us so poorly, where people's lives are now at risk in the countries which they've invested in, maybe even in the countries where they were born. I was born in the UK, and I can tell you so many stories about the way I grew up and how hard it was for me. There are things in life that never leave you, things that happen to you when you're a child. And so when you talk about stop Asian hate, you're actually talking about stop Chinese hate. Think of us as people who deserve the same dignity as you demand for yourselves. And I'll go back to the first point of tolerance, because that word tolerance is taught to me by someone in Norway. And she's currently the Crown Princess of Norway. And we were meeting in the context of HIV and AIDS and worked together for a number of years on that after that. And I said to her, I don't like the word tolerance, because, in the English context, I tolerate you is sort of like I'm going to put up with you. And she said, I never thought about it that way, because in my country and in our community of people, we think of tolerance as the most beautiful word. So she taught me that word in the summer of 2008, and it's never 2009, and it's never left me. And even though we came to BRI very late in this conversation, I hope that what we were conversing on and engaging on before then helps give people an understanding of what BRI is. It has to do with that multilateralism, and it comes at a time when the world is thirsting and crying out, not just for political leadership, but moral leadership, especially from our political leaders, but as you said, from our cities, from our regions, and from our young people as well.
If we ever were going to have a dialogue, well, here is a perfect example of it, James. Thank you very much. And by the way, as a relative, I think you are a champion. As an uncle, father, son, they're all lucky to have you, James. I have learned a huge amount from you. Alan and I are really appreciative of the time you've given us, given how busy you are and how many different hats you wear in your daily life. And you've left a deep impression on us, and I hope that our audiences will also feel the same way. So it is really appreciated that you've given us so generously so much of your time and ideas, and yourself, James. Thank you.
I want to thank you both for trusting me, for allowing me a little time to speak about the story of a people and a culture, and also to all the people who make this dialogue possible. Ali, my best wishes, and Anush, my best wishes, and to everybody at your institute at Durham University, which I think is one of the oldest and most renowned centers of its kind and of that degree of excellence, not only in Europe, but around the world as well. Your dialogue is making understanding possible, and I hope that it melts away some of the barriers in our minds of intolerance.
Thank you very much, James. I'm sure we will have you soon back on the program in the new year. Thank you.